Hey guys, coming back for 11/22/63, episode 3, Other Voices, Other Rooms, and I was really looking forward to this episode. I've really been enjoying this show overall, and I gotta say, what Vinyl's doing wrong, this show's doing right. What Vinyl's doing wrong is that it's very slow-paced, and it's not really it's going places, but there are like a million different storylines, and this episode did exactly what Vinyl should do. I mean, it's sticking to the plot, it's you know, keeping things interesting, and this episode did a lot of things I really love. We actually have now people for Jake to talk to, but let's just get into this episode. There was a lot of really great things about it. Was it as good as last week's? I mean, I'd say yeah, but it's definitely not, like, as amazing as last week's was. This was still a really great episode. It was a transition episode, but there still were some great things about it, but let's just get into it. So, as we know, last week, we ended on a cliffhanger. We see Jake drives through the rain, Bill trains his gun on him, and of course, he wants to know how he has this newspaper dated 1963, because of course it's 1960, and Bill plans to take Jake to the cops, and Jake points out that they'll arrest both of them, and he points out that Bill was in the Dunning house, and he'll be an accomplice, so basically, he's in trouble anyway. And Bill asks about Al's burnt files, and Jake finally explains that he's there to prevent Kenny's assassination and says that he's come from 2016. And of course, Bill thinks he's crazy, but basically, he's forced to admit the truth. And I like that Jake told him the truth. I was worried that Jake was going to hide things from him, but no, he told him the truth. And I understand that. I mean, Bill needed answers, and Jake knew he could trust him, so he gave him the answers that he wanted. So Jake and Bill go to a motel, get a room, and Bill wonders why Jake doesn't take out Oswald right now, which, is a good question, but of course we know why. The teacher points out that Oswald's in Russia at the moment and comes back in 1962, and Bill demands proof of Jake's claim, because he's not fully sure that Jake really is from 2016. He thinks that Jake could be crazy. So Jake tells him to look in Al's book, and Bill finds a page with the sports winners in 1962, and he asks if Jake could save someone else as well. He shows him a photo of his sister Clara, who, of course, we know was murdered by Frank, and Jake, as much as he wants to help him, he explains that he can only go back in 1960. And I like the way that Jake said, he said, look, I can only go back to 1960, that's just how it works, I'm sorry. It really shows that Jake is a good person, and that he really does want to help Bill. He just can't, because he can't go back all the way back to 1960. He can only go, he can only go back to 1960. So he offers Bill $100 to drive him to Dallas, and Bill points out that he could shoot Jake and take the 100, and Jake agrees, and after a moment, Bill agrees to take him to Dallas, and basically, later Jake wakes up from a nightmare of killing Frank, which is understandable. I mean, after killing Frank, obviously that has to be in his head, and I'm happy that there isn't an investigation going around with Frank. I think it's unnecessary. I think it just creates a bunch of unnecessary drama that we don't need, and I'd much rather see the psychological impact than the actual, investigation. I'd rather not see that. So he attacks Bill until he gets a hold of himself. He apologizes for freaking out, notices the beating scars on Bill's back, and so he was beating pretty hard. But also you can tell that Bill was probably beaten badly by Frank as well, because we know that Bill and Frank definitely had some sort of connections, of course, because Frank murdered his sister, and Frank probably beat him, so they go to Dolly Plaza in Dallas, and Jake points out that the book depository where Oswald will shoot Kennedy, and he hopes that he can stop the assassination based on his knowledge from the future, but admits that he doesn't know everything. He doesn't know everything that's going to happen. And we then get one scene of Al in this episode, which I was fine with. I can understand if people are like, oh, we're just seeing Al because they want to have Al in every episode. But no, I thought this was a good scene, because Al tells Jake about how everyone felt in the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, how they didn't know what happened, but they just knew that something had been broken in them and could never be repaired. It's pretty much like if you grew up when 9/11 happened, which I can't remember because I was like 4 when it happened, but that's very much like Kennedy's assassination. A lot of people say that Kennedy's assassination is the day the world was no longer innocent. Like, it was the loss of innocence, really. That was like the day of that. So Jake tells Bill that Oswald tried to kill General Walker before Kennedy using the same gun. Then if he kills Oswald, it will save Kennedy, and they stop at a window filled with TV showing Kennedy, and Jake pays Bill the $100. And I like that Jake pretty much explained everything he needs to do to Bill, because Bill obviously is still very confused, and Bill says that he wants to save Kennedy as well, and admits that he has nothing for him in Kentucky, and I like that Bill admitted this, because we know that Bill was a bartender, but he really doesn't have much of a life here, and Jake finally agrees, and they drive Jodie, Texas. Now, I like this. One, it keeps things fun, because Jake and Bill's really good comic relief. He actually becomes very funny in one scene that we'll get to. Two, I like that Jake has a sidekick. I like that Jake's not just doing this on his own. Now, I heard that the book, Bill's kind of just a guy that's there for like a couple appearances and then he dies or something like that. I don't really know. But I know some people are upset about that. I don't really care. I like the way this was done. I think they have a really good dynamic, and I think they work very well together. The actors, James Franco and then whoever plays Bill, they work very well together. So basically, Jake finally agrees. They drive Jodie, Texas, between Dallas and Fort Worth, where Oswald will be leaving. And until Oswald returns to the U.S. in 1962, they have to get jobs and blend in, because obviously they can't make it seem like they're on some sort of a mission that nobody knows about, so they have to try to look less suspicious. So at the Jodie High School, Jake applies as a substitute teacher in response to an ad, which would make sense since he's a teacher in real life, and Principal Deke Simmons interviews him, warns that he'll need discipline to deal with the students, and he then asks Jake about Catcher in the Rye, and where it should be banned from the school library, and Jake points out that they live in the U.S. and that it shouldn't be banned, even though it deals with things like rape and things like that. And a satisfied Deke calls in his secretary, Mimi Corcoran, and I really like this character. I really do like her. She tells her that Jake answered the question. However, he says that they'll never have Catcher in the Rye in their library. The principal says that Jake can work part-time until the current teacher retires, and outside the office, Mimi offers to get Jake a room at the local boarding house. Jake goes out, tells Bill the news. Bill wants to go to Dallas to celebrate because he's sick of small towns, and so yeah, Jake's now got his job, and we don't really know what Bill's doing. Bill doesn't really seem to be doing much. He's kind of just his sidekick. So in Dallas, Jake and Bill go to a nightclub, and we get one of the funniest scenes to date in the entire show. Bill gets very drunk. The manager comes over. Jake claims that Bill's his younger brother. Bill asks the man if he's going to vote for Kennedy, and Jake shushes him. The manager wonders if Jake has a problem with Kennedy, and he insists that Kennedy is a great man, and he introduces himself as Jack Ruby, who is the man that's going to kill Oswald after Oswald kills Kennedy. So obviously, Jake is pretty shocked that he's coming in contact with this man. But of course, they don't know that yet, so obviously he can't really look any suspicious. So a drunken Bill starts talking about how Jake plans to do big things and came from the future. But luckily, since Bill is drunk, Ruby just dismisses it as just a drunken joke, and Jake gets Bill out, which I thought was pretty funny the way that Bill was doing that, so I really did enjoy that scene. Definitely very funny stuff there. So the next day in Jodie, Jake stops for gas, and I imagine that Jodie's the place where Jake is going to stay for the rest of the series, right? That would make sense, because obviously that's where Oswald's going to be. That's probably where we're going to be. There's no more of, shifting around. Now, maybe we will shift somewhere else, but knowing the life that Jake makes in this town in this episode, he's probably going to stay here. So the next day in Jodie, Jake stops for gas. Bill is sleeping it off in the back of his car. Jake wakes him up, has him recite their cover story, and basically their story is that they're from Maine, and they're two brothers from Maine. Jake was born in a northern part, that's how he lost his accent, and basically that's the story they need to stick to, and it's true, they need to stick to that story or else they're gonna look suspicious, and especially if people know their story, they need to stick to that. So I really like that Jake is trying to hammer in, look, we really need to, if you really want to go on this mission with me, you have to tell the right story, and he then warns Bill that he almost gave them away. Bill drives him to the school where student Mike Kozlaw comes in and asks Mimi if his girlfriend Bobby Jill Alnick can change to home ec, and Jake offers to get Mimi a black cup of coffee, and the white Facilian students stare at him, obviously because she's black, and that's why. So you can definitely see that it's hard for Jake to adjust here, but then I love the way this next scene was done, because after we go to commercial, which, yeah, it's annoying, Hulu commercials, whatever, we see Jake, he walks through the gym, basically, where students are preparing for an upcoming dance, and then we shift to 1961, and then go all the way to 1962, so we do have a time jump in this episode, which I can understand why people are saying, oh, we didn't really get to see Jake struggle or whatever, but that's not really what's important. We need to get to 1962, because guys, remember, this is an 8-episode series, and the end of the show needs to take us to 11/22/63, so it made sense why we had to shift all the way to, 62, because believe it or not, next week, we're halfway done with this, so basically, I thought it made sense for them to go all the way 1962, and the time jump actually, I think, benefits the show, because it keeps things from being too slow-paced, because I want to ask you guys, if this time jump hadn't happened, do you think the show would have been too slow-paced? I do think it would be. I mean, not that the first half wasn't great, the second half really is what makes this episode so great. I mean, there's so many great dynamics in the second half, I really did love it, and Jake's lesson as well, he teaches them about the, I believe was the most dangerous game, the book that they were reading. I just, then the thing I liked about this teaching scene is, as we know, in the present, Jake's class really isn't interested in what he's talking about, and here in the 1960s, they are interested. And you can definitely tell in this episode that Jake is definitely starting to get attached to this world, which is something that Al said not to do. So Mimi talks to Jake, and she introduced him to Sadie, who you remember Jake met in Dallas during his first trip there. In the first episode, we saw her for like 5 minutes. We see a lot more of her here, and the good thing is that the girl that plays Sadie has very good chemistry with James Franco. They work very well together, and their scenes were by far some of my favorite in this episode. He reminds her of how they met, and Mimi explains that Sadie is their new librarian, and when Jake mentions her husband Johnny, Sadie insists that she's never been married, which there is a reason why, which is very interesting. So Mimi explains that the two teachers that were scheduled to chaperone the dance, but they had to drop out, and Sadie has volunteered, and Mimi wants Jake to help. You can tell that Mimi and Jake have really created this sort of like principal-teacher friendship, which I really do like seeing. I think Mimi and Jake, they work very well as friends. I like her character overall. And when Jake says he has a commitment, Deke comes over and tells him to reschedule it. Jake gives in, and once they're alone, Deke tells him to thank him later, and basically, later in Foot Roth, Jake and Bill go to the apartment up or rent near where Oswald and his family will move in. And I don't think this is saying that they haven't had a place to live. I think they had a place to live, but obviously they need to move closer to Oswald because their main mission is, getting as much details on Oswald as they can. How can they stop him? What is his plan? Does he plan to murder Kennedy? Things like that. And I really think we did get into the character of Oswald here. Well, at least as much as they did. Something I liked about this episode is that it stayed, strictly in Jake and Bill's perspective. We don't know, anything else about Oswald more than what Jake and Bill know, which I like seeing. I think that's very well done the way they did that, because had they moved to Oswald, it'd be like, oh, we know this, but they don't. It would kind of lose sort of the magic of this show. The part of the show is that Jake and Bill are trying to get as much information as they can, and we should know as much information as they do. No more, no less, definitely. So they go to the apartment up or rent near where Oswald and his family will move in. The manager lets them in, and Jake shows Bill where Oswald will be living. And when Jake drives back to Jodie, he pulls into a gas station, and Mimi walks out. She explains the attendant wouldn't sell her gas because she's black, and Jake tells the attendant he's going to buy some gas in a can. The attendant realizes that Jake is buying it for Mimi and refuses and says that she can buy her gas across the tracks. And Jake literally tells him he's just like, fuck off, and he even says, excuse my language, Mimi. Just the way that he cares about her is great. I love seeing Jake is a good man, and that's one of my favorite things about the show, is that Jake is a good man. He's not an anti-hero, and it really works for this show. I mean, they could have easily had Jake be this anti-hero, but he really is a good man, and that's good for a main character who's trying to save Kennedy. That's something that works very well here. So he yells at the attendant to shut up when he protests, and once he's done, Jake throws the money on the ground and helps Mimi into his car, and really nice scene. I really like that. So later, Jake returns to Fort Worth and tells Bill that the equipment will be over soon. One of the local toughs, Raphael, makes kissing noises, and Bill tells him to shut up. Raphael figures that Jake and Bill are lovers, and Jake gets a protesting Bill into the car, which is pretty funny. Again, some really funny scenes between Jake and Bill. I really do like this dynamic. And as they drive off, Jake reminds Bill that they have to stay under the radar, and they have to stick to that story. So they go to Love Field, and Jake watches as Oswald and his wife, Marina, arrive in the U.S., and Lee's mother, Margaret, and her younger son, Bobby, come over to greet Oswald, and Oswald wonders where the reporters are to greet the only U.S. Marine who ever defected, and Margaret tells him to hush and takes him home. And back at the tenement apartment, Jake tells Bill that Oswald lives with Margaret for a week, and they need to bug Oswald's place and find out who he's talking to about Walker, because obviously that's the first thing you need to see. Is he going to kill Walker? Things like that, because that's what's going to lead him to see, okay, if he kills Walker, does he really kill Kennedy? Obviously, they still don't know, remember, if Oswald is the one that kills Kennedy. That's just a rumor. So Jake's contacts Silent Mike, delivers the recording equipment. They listen to his speech by Walker on the radio. Silent Mike admits that he served with Walker in World War II, and the electrician then shows off the directional and wireless mics that he's brought and mentions that Walker's having a rally in a week, and Jake agrees and pays off Silent Mike, who thinks that they're bugging Jake's wife to get information for a divorce, and that was very smart of him, because obviously they can't tell him the truth. They need to be as secret as possible, and before he goes, Jake tells Bill that he'll be back at 10, and at the dance, Jake nervously checks checks his watch as he checks in with Sadie, and by far one of my favorite scenes of the episode was this whole dance scene. Just everything about this was great, and again, it's a good way of slowing things down, but not slowing things down too much. This episode had very good pacing, like it knew when to be fast and knew when to be slow, and I really like that. That's something that the show, I think, has done very well in general. This was the shortest episode, but it made sense, definitely. So they spot Mike and his friend spiking the punch. He has the students hand over their flasks, and Jake and Sadie take the punch bowl into a nearby classroom. They sample the punch, and Sadie explains that she's claiming that she was never married because people in Texas aren't big on divorcees. So she is, in fact, divorced, and Jake says that he left, which is true. Back in the 60s, you know, divorce wasn't as common, so it makes sense why she doesn't really want to admit that. So Jake says he left Maine for the same reason, and after they share a drink, Sadie says that her cousins are from Lisbon, Maine, and she says that she was there 2 years ago, just when Jake arrived from 2016, which is very interesting. So Jake goes back to the dance and finds Sadie dancing. She invites him to join in with the line dancing, but he sits it out, and the DJ puts on an older song from when he says Sadie and Jake were kids, which of course Jake wasn't a kid then, but Sadie was. And Jake dances with a surprise Sadie, and he explains his ex-wife made him take dance lessons, which, again, very good way to cover things up. And afterward, Jake says that they make a good team, and a flustered Sadie says they beg her back to chaperoning. She clearly wants to keep things professional. You can tell she likes him, but she wants to keep things strictly professional. And Jake realizes that it's 10 minutes to 10, tells Sadie he has an emergency, but will be back in, he says, 2 hours tops. And basically in for it, where Jake and Bill break into Oswald's future apartment, sure that he's at Margaret's. They plant the bugs, but are interrupted when someone opens the door. The two men hide in the closet as Oswald and Marina come in to get some privacy from Margaret. Marina says in her halting English that she thought it would be a little bit nicer, and as they have sex in the bed, Jake gets the attic hatch open, climbs up with Bill. They crawl across the insulation-filled rafters, and Bill panics when a spider crawls on his hand, which obviously we know that scares him, and it scares, you know, Jake too. If you remember, he was startled by bugs. So Lee and Marina hear him scream, and basically Jake kicks the vent out. Two of the men climb down, run to their apartment across the street. Jake warns that it's the past pushing back as they get closer to Oswald, and of course, you know, that's what Al said would happen, is that the past is pushing back. This is how it's pushing back, is that's going to ruin Jake from getting information. And the voice-activated tape recorders start. The two men realize that they planted the bug successfully, and Jake tells Bill to listen for anything Oswald says about Walker, and the teacher realizes that it's almost midnight and he missed getting back to Sadie, and obviously he feels terrible about that, because he does care about Sadie. And that's something I like. This isn't fake. Like, his whole thing with Sadie, it's not fake. He clearly does truly care about her, and he really does want to, you know, help her out and, you know, be a chaperone. He wants to be a good chaperone there, which I like seeing. The problem is that Jake wants to do everything, and he really can. He really needs to figure out, what can I do, what can I not? So the next day at the school, Jake apologizes to Sadie. She dismisses it as nothing and leaves. She's clearly upset, though, and Mimi, of course, berates him for, you know, leaving Sadie to chaperone alone, which I can totally understand. Jake tries to apologize to her, but she doesn't really buy it. She's not necessarily mad, but she's just disappointed because she's known Jake. This is not like him, and she doesn't know why he did this. So the Oswalds move into their apartment, and Jake listens as they argue. All Oswald does is complain that Marina sits around the house all day, and Margaret comes over one night. She and Oswald talk privately. The older woman complains that Marina dresses like a slut, and Oswald agrees, and they're really not getting any information on General Walker, none of it. But the next day, this is when things get really interesting. George D. Mohrenschildt and his wife Jean arrive to welcome the Oswalds to the U.S., and of course, if you remember, George is from CIA from his last visit to Dallas 2 years ago, and he tells Bill that if they have to hear, it's shooting Kennedy is Oswald's idea or George's, because if you remember, Oswald could have worked with George, as we know. Oswald is definitely working with George, and we need to know, you know, whose idea really was this. So Jake and Bill listen, and the couple speak in Russian. The Mohrenschildt, sorry if I can't pronounce their last name right, they leave, and Jake figures that they need to get an English-Russian dictionary, and I love that when Jake was like, we should have just spent the last 2 years learning Russian. I thought that was pretty funny. He goes to the school library to get one, tells Bill to make sure the tapes keep running, because they don't know Russian, obviously, and of course, this is pretty useless if it's all going to be Russian, but then when Jake comes back, Bill is unconscious on the floor. He explains that Raphael and his friends broke in, stole the recording equipment. If you remember, Raphael was the one that was kind of making fun of them, thought that they were a gay couple. Jake and Bill break into Raphael's apartment, claim to be FBI agents, and discover that he's torn up all the tapes, and when Raphael figures that they're not FBI, Jake punches him, and Bill points out that Raphael's daughter is hiding behind a table, and Jake has Raphael help them take the equipment back to their apartment, and basically, later at school, which luckily they were able to get the equipment back, so I was very happy about that. So basically later at school, Sadie's in the hallway, drops some books. Jake comes over to help her and apologizes, and she kisses him and says that she liked dancing with him and tells him to take her out to dinner the coming weekend. Sadie says that she doesn't see any reason to waste their time and half jokingly tells him not to do anything like that to her again. So you can tell these two are definitely going to connect romantically, and I like seeing that. I think this is good for Jake, but again, what was the one thing that Al said? Do not get attached, and it's clear that Jake is. I mean, has a very good bond with Mimi. He has this very tight bond with Sadie, and he, of course, has this partnership with Bill, so he definitely is getting attached, and I don't really see Jake leaving. I could see Jake definitely staying in the past even after he prevents Kenny's assassination. I could definitely see that happening. So Bill hears Oswald tell Maria that he's going to Walker's rally with the Sisters of Southern Heritage. He and Jake get in, listen as Walker speaks out against the Kennedys. Jake spots Lee and George in the audience, and Jake figures that George brought Oswald there to bait him, basically. So that way, if this was George's fault, he could frame Oswald for it. And afterwards, Silent Mike offers to introduce Jake and Bill to Walker, and as they decline and head to their car, Oswald approaches Walker, calls him a fascist. George watches as Walker's men hold Oswald back. Oswald screams that they did the same thing in Munich before World War II. One of the soldiers punches Oswald, yells at them to wake up or he'll kill them all, and that's how the episode ends. So it pretty much seems like Oswald is going to kill Walker, that he doesn't indeed kill him, and he is clearly working with George, so it pretty much seems like all the information is right. Now they just need to figure out where they're going to go from here, because, of course, like Jake said, they need to not let, Oswald and his wife and his mother know them. They don't want them to know them because obviously that could make them targets. They could get killed, and obviously they don't want to get killed. So they need to stay undercover right now. They need to simply just stay as sources. Like, this is just information. Like, they're not really there. Like, they don't know them, things like that. And that's clearly something that definitely is going to be a problem. We'll have to see what happens there. But overall, guys, amazing episode. Really great stuff. Let's talk about Jake and Sadie. I like where this is headed, but at the same time, like Al said, you can't get attached, and it's clear that Jake is getting attached to Sadie, and you can tell that he is going to try to change things for Sadie, but then the past pushes back next week when we see that Sadie's husband still could be married to her, so that's very strange, and again, you can tell the past is definitely pushing back for things that Jake did, and especially, of course, after killing Frank, it's definitely going to come back to haunt him. I mean, I'm sure that death is over him because now it's been 2 years, but we'll have to see what happens with that. That definitely is very interesting. I like the friendship he's created with Mimi, definitely good stuff there. His teaching position, I like it as well. I think it really suits Jake well, because like I said, Jake already is a teacher. He's a teacher, he knows what he's doing, and I like seeing Jake, with that occupation. He's very good at what he does there. Now, let's talk about George. Who tells Oswald? Does George tell Oswald to kill Kenny, or does Oswald choose to kill Kenny? I mean, from that, I could see Oswald doing it all on his own, because that wasn't something that George told him, because you remember, George, Walker's men, they held Oswald back, and Oswald was the one that was freaking out, and basically, threatening to kill Walker, so if Oswald does in fact kill Walker, he probably is the one that kills Kenny, and George definitely was working with him, but I'm pretty sure that Oswald is the one that kills Kenny, and that definitely is going to be very interesting to see what happens with that. Like I said, I like the partnership between Jake and Bill, but I really hope Bill doesn't ruin things for Jake, because we saw that Bill almost blew their cover, and that would be really bad for Jake if he did. They were this close, I mean, really this close to Bill breaking their cover. I really hope that he doesn't break their cover, because that wouldn't end well for anyone, so we'll have to see what happens with that. Definitely interesting stuff there. And they're not really getting the information they need right now, from those tape records. All they had was stuff like, oh, Marina's a slut, or things like, Marina sits around the house all the time. They're not really getting the information that they need, and obviously they need that information to know, is Kenny, in fact, does Oswald, in fact, want to kill Kenny? We don't really know about that yet. The thing is, Kenny's now president, so obviously, now's the time when they can really start to figure out what's going on, what they're gonna do, because that's gonna be very interesting, definitely. And I like that we're now in 1962. Like I said, I like the time jump. I can understand if you guys don't like the time jump. Like, I can totally understand that, definitely, because of the time jump. I mean, I understand, really, I do. I can totally understand if you guys don't really like the time jump. I think the time jump works very well for the show. It keeps things interesting. It keeps things from getting boring, and I like that they did the time jump. It definitely makes sense why they had to do that. Overall, guys, I love this episode. Really loving this show every week, I gotta say. Really amazing stuff, week to week. Definitely really enjoying it. Raphael as well, what's going to happen with that? I mean, he clearly is going to be a problem for Bill. I like that they were able to kind of use him and tell him, look, you got to do this for us. I understand that. But he's going to be a problem. I mean, if he's going to take their equipment and things like that, and yes, he gave it back to them, but I don't think this is the end of Raphael. I think he's going to be a problem, and I definitely think Bill could be a problem as well, because we know when Bill gets drunk, he starts talking nonsense, things like that, so we'll have to see what's going on there. Bill needs to get a job, definitely. Bill needs to get a job. I mean, we don't know if he has a job, but he needs to get one, because obviously he needs to stay undercover, and they need to stick to the story as well. Let's hope they stick to the story. We'll have to see what happens there. So overall, guys, like I said, really loving this show. Definitely really love this episode. Amazing stuff overall. No matter what you guys saw this episode, absolutely love this episode, I gotta say. And probably out of all the things I'm watching, 11/22/63 probably is my favorite, I gotta say. So no matter what you guys saw this episode, love to hear your thoughts on it. I will see you guys in my next video, which will be for Better Call Saul, and I will see you guys for that. Okay, bye.